Good evening, church. Good to see you this afternoon, this evening. Did you have a good afternoon? Anybody get a nap? All right. It's Sunday afternoon nap. There's nothing like it. Seems like the weather has changed a little bit. So here we go into a new season. Looking forward to that. Looking forward to a new church year with you all. It's been a busy, busy summer. A lot going on. The Lord has accomplished a lot. I'd like to take just a few minutes tonight before we open our Bibles and talk to you about my experience last week in Houston. Some of you have already been through the training and you're headed down there. I don't know if you'll go to the same place where they deployed me and my team, but it will give you an idea. And maybe some of you, as you listen to this and look at it, would think, I could do that. Maybe the Lord is speaking to my heart about giving a week of my time and providing some disaster relief and looking for some ministry opportunities. That's the main thing. People do need physical help. That's important. But there are a lot of organizations like the Red Cross and so forth who can provide that physical help. There's something that we have that we can provide that's even more important. And when people are distraught, a lot of times they're searching. They have questions, and it's a good time to speak with them about where they stand with the Lord. But let me just show you a few pictures that I took, and actually I didn't take that one, so it's making me a liar right away. I gave some pictures to my wife this afternoon, and she said, "Here, I added this one in. I found it on Facebook. Is that okay?" And I've learned, I've been married over 30 years, and so I'm really, really good at saying, "Yes, dear," okay? I know how marriage works. That's our team right in front of the Arkansas Baptist State Convention getting ready to leave. That's the vehicle that we went in. Geyer Springs First Baptist Church made that vehicle available to us. That looks fancy and big, but let me tell you something. Ours is better. I'm just telling you. Ours is better. That thing was a rattle trap, Long trips, I don't know if you're like me, on a long trip you go to sleep. My head is doing this thing. But any slight little bump in the road was boom, boom. But anyway, I appreciate them letting us use their vehicle, absolutely, and their driver. We went to the NRG Park. I like the fact that Wesley is just moving through these without me giving her any indication at all. She's like, "Time to move on, Pastor," okay? We went to NRG Park. NRG Park has the NRG Stadium, where the Houston Texans play, and right next to that is the NRG. It's called the NRG Superdome now. It just used to be the Superdome, where they used to play football, and this huge convention center, and that's where we spent most of our time. That's one of the rooms inside the convention center. You may not be able to make it out, but what you're looking at are rows and rows of cots. There were 3 rooms this size, one for single males, one for single females, and one for families. And people who have had to leave their houses, this is the space that they have left. And they're no privacy. You're just living there in this big room with all of these other people. Keep going, Wesley. There's all kinds of support there. There was a mobile pharmacy. There was a clinic. There was a police station. They've set up a city in this convention center. Heavy security. The Houston police. The state police. I saw FBI there. I don't know what they were doing there. And military personnel. This was a place set up, the one that she just went past, you really can't tell, where people could bring their pets. In prior disaster relief efforts, they've said, we don't do anything for animals. You got to leave your animal behind. Well, if you're an animal person, that is pretty major drama or trauma right there. So these disaster relief people have learned some people need their animals, and so they had a section set up for pets, and they had some other stuff set up. Keep on going, Wesley. There was water everywhere. Everywhere you turn, there's pallets of water, and that reminded me of when we went down with Tommy and Travis, went down to Katrina and spent a week. There was water everywhere because people don't have water. They don't have drinking water. You don't think about that. We just have that at hand. Of course, after a week in New Orleans, I came back saying water. And I had to learn how to say water again. But that's all right. There were books set out for people to read, which I thought was great. There were places set up with computers so they could check Facebook. I guess Facebook is kind of like your pet now. I don't know. People freak out if they don't have that, so keep going. That's the dining room. It's kind of hard to tell how big that really is. That's the room. Some of you may have seen this. A week ago Saturday, that's the room that President Trump was in. And we were in that room about 5 or 6 hours after he came. There's another picture of it, and there's the serving line. If you can tell, that line just goes all the way back and then around the corner, and then the living quarters are on the other side. These rooms are huge. This NRG Center is over a quarter of a mile long. It's 590 feet wide. It has 2 levels. Each level has 72,000 square feet for a total of 1.4 million square feet of space. It's just a gigantic building. Keep going, Wesley. They had musical groups at almost every meal. You never knew what it was going to be. This was a classical quartet that came in to play. There was all different kinds of music. Keep going. There's the serving line again, looking from behind. Serving line again, looking from behind. Keep going. And this is where I spent my week. All right? So if you thought this was going to be glamorous, let me just disabuse you of that right away. There's absolutely no glamour at all, not in what I did. I spent 5 days out here in the back parking lot. That's the dock on the back of the building, and that's where all the equipment is set up to prepare the food and do the washing that is necessary to feed over 3,000 people at every meal. And that number changes. Keep going. This is how it starts. The food comes in refrigerated trucks. Keep going. And then they choose the meals. It's all been, we work hand in hand. Southern Baptist Disaster Relief works hand in hand with the Red Cross. Keep going. And there's the generator. Most of this equipment that you're about to see belongs to Arkansas Baptist State Convention. You can see Unit 1 right there. The tent kind of covers it up. That's a 40-foot trailer that's got all the equipment in it to prepare meals for tens of thousands of people. It's an amazing unit. I should have taken some pictures closer up. This is a unit from Arkadelphia. We work together with them, Red River Baptist Association. You can't read it, but that's a list of all the disasters that they've been to, that they've printed on the side of their unit. Camden, Arkansas is on that list, I noticed. That was kind of a strange feeling to walk up and read through there, and it said Camden. You remember the storm that came through here a couple of years ago. They were here help cut trees and so forth. Keep going. There's a little bit closer to Unit 1. It opens up in the middle. It's just a 40-foot trailer. It opens up in the middle so that the equipment can be taken out. That's what I lived with all week. They're called Cambros. A Cambro is like a large cooler, and the top comes off of it, and it has a plastic bag in it, and the food goes in that bag. It's very large, and the top goes on, and it keeps food hot or cold for several hours so that it can be taken out to people in neighborhoods, or in this case, also served to the people inside. Those Cambros have to be washed. This is the washing station with, they used a high-powered sprayer with hot water, and then they have to be reassembled with clean hands because food's going back in and they just keep coming back through. This is what Tommy and Travis are, I can see the look of recognition on their face. We got to be good friends with Cambros after Katrina in New Orleans. There's some clean Cambros. These are just some pictures of the wash station where I was, just out there in the sun, on the concrete, very hot. Good hard work if you like hard work. Just keep going. That's the washing station. Right next door was this group. These are people that showed up from somewhere in Texas that cooked barbecue. And they cooked barbecue all week. We fed the people inside, and they fed us. Can you tell what you're looking at there? That's a 40-foot trailer barbecue. Yeah, when I saw that, I said, now I know I'm in Texas. So I want you to imagine you get up at get out on the tarmac, so to speak, there to work at 7:30 in the morning, and you're working till about 11:30 until you get lunch, and for that entire time, you're smelling barbecue cook, okay? But, you know, there's a lesson in everything. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Absolutely. That was just feet away from where I was working, and it was just cooking the greatest smelling barbecue that you ever smelled. Keep going. That's the wash station right there. Keep going. There more wash station. I guess I took a lot of pictures there because I spent a lot of time there. That's the Red River Baptist Association. Through that tunnel is all their cooking. They're preparing food. Wash station. Okay, so a lot of the food went inside to feed evacuees. Some of it went on these vehicles. They're called ERVs, Emergency Relief Vehicles. They're old ambulances, or look like ambulances. They fill the back of those up with food and then go out into the affected neighborhoods. And on the other side of each one is a window that opens up, and people line up, and you feed them right directly out of the ERV. I got a chance to go out one time in an ERV to a neighborhood, which sort of broke things up a little bit. I thought some of you would be interested in seeing this. You may not be able to read that, but that's coffee, okay? They had everything, all right? They had everything, and it was all done in a big way. Keep going. This was interesting. One afternoon, in fact, it was 2 afternoons in a row, this vehicle shows up, and this guy jumps out, real energetic, and he's got a couple of young ladies in the back of the van, and he starts giving everybody smoothies. He says, "You want a smoothie? You want a smoothie?" And before he left, everybody was drinking a smoothie. And I noticed as he was leaving that his plate on his van was New York State. I don't know where else he would be coming from but New York with a New York tag on, so I'm assuming, I never got a chance to ask him, assume the guy jumped in his van and drove all the way down to Texas to pass out smoothies. But everybody was pretty happy with that, you know, because it was hot. Yeah, at the end of the day, this is where you go to take a shower. It's also a trailer, and it's part of disaster relief. And let me tell you, when you're out there doing this kind of stuff, the shower unit people are really important. You show them a lot of love, okay? Because you don't want to work around a bunch of people who don't get to shower all week. That's the shower unit on the left. The one on the right is a laundry unit. So you can take your clothes down there, and they'll wash your clothes for you as well. You don't take 2 or 3 days worth of clothes. If you're going to be there a week or longer, you're good. They'll wash your clothes for you. And this, I just took a picture here. That's the highest I saw gas in all of our travels. This was just north of Houston, 269. Not too bad considering all that's going on. And that was it. You know, I was talking to one of the disaster relief guys while we were down there. Some of these folks have done this a lot. They go out almost yearly, sometimes more than once. A lot of them are retired. And I'll tell you, some of them put me to shame. I'll be honest with you. The lady that I went out on the ERV with, it was 2 ladies. One was a younger lady who grew up in Georgia and moved to Alaska. The other one was from Utah, and she was a Mormon. And she was a retired middle school teacher who had congestive heart failure and had the, what's the device that they put in to keep your heart going? Had that. And I looked at her and I said, "Should you be here?" And she said, "I know when to stop." And I said, "I hope so, because we're fixing to spend about 4 or 5 hours together, and I don't want to have to try to bring you back to life again, you know. I'm not even sure I know how to do that well." And a lot of our team were folks in their 70s. There was one guy there who was 84, 85 years old. You know, some of these folks don't move very fast, okay? No offense, but they don't move very fast. They don't even stand up very good, okay? The backbone is moving down a little bit, and they're out there in the heat of the day carrying a Cambro or something, walking about like this, some of them. There was one guy that came down to the work area with a walker. Another guy came down with a cane, and then they put their stuff away and went to work. It shamed me, you know, because I was tired. I'm thinking, well, gosh, I'm 12 years older than the last time I did this. I don't know if I can handle this. I saw them working. I shut up, you know, because they were putting in a day's work. They're serious. But they love the Lord. They love the people. And I asked one of them who had been on a lot of disasters, I said, "Does it seem like that there's more disasters in our country And without skipping a beat, he said, oh yeah, it just seems like they're increasing. The hurricanes and the tornadoes, because ever since we've been to Katrina, I kind of keep an eye on this. Every time there's an article or they go out, I think about them, and it just seems like they're constantly going out to something. A lot of times in Arkansas, because we have a lot of bad storms here and have had over the last few years. I got to thinking, there's Hurricane Harvey, there's Hurricane Irma, which right now is disabusing Florida. There were fires out in California, one of the biggest fires that anybody's seen. And then while we were down there, an 8.1 earthquake hit Mexico. And there was an earthquake hitting Baja, Mexico at the same time. It just seems like there's all this stuff going on, and it you ask yourself, what's happening? Is God in all of this? Is he trying to talk to us? Is he trying to tell us something? If so, what is he saying? What is it we're supposed to get out of this? And on top of all of that, in my Bible reading, my personal Bible reading during the week, I'm in 1 Samuel right now, and I came across this text that I wanted to share with you tonight. If you'll open your Old Testament up to 1 Samuel chapter 12. 1 Samuel chapter 12. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 12, we're coming to the end of the rule or the leadership of Samuel, who is the last judge. And he will pass the leadership baton in Israel to the first king. And the first king's name is Saul. And Saul started out strong, but he didn't end very well. And then David takes his place. But Samuel, when it came time for him to step down and pass on leadership to the next generation in Israel, he apparently hoped that his sons would be able to step up. But the people refused to have his sons take over. Instead, they insisted that Samuel give them a king. They said, we want to be like the peoples around us. All the other people have a king. We want a king. And Samuel was unhappy with that. I think he had personal reasons for it, but he was also a man of God, and he understood that their motives were not correct and that they were insulting God, because God had served as their king up until that point, and the judges were really just his hands and feet. They spoke for him, but Israel understood that they were a theocracy, that God was their ruler. Now, asking for a king in and of itself was not necessarily a bad thing, because way back in Moses' day, he predicted in the book of Deuteronomy that the time would come when Israel would have a king. And so it was inevitable that they would have a king. It's just that they did it wrong. They were rejecting God in the way that they asked for the king. And Samuel knew that. And this unusual episode happens here in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Look at verse 16. Samuel has had this discussion already with the people about how they have failed in their way of asking for the king, but he's told them, you're going to get your king. And he's warned them what that means. And then he comes along here in verse 16. He says, now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not the wheat harvest now? I will call upon the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. Then Samuel called on the Lord, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain, so all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. Now notice it says that it's the wheat harvest. And this is important for us to understand this text. Why is the wheat harvest important? Does anybody know? Normally it's a dry period, and so to predict a storm during the wheat harvest is like predicting a freeze in South Arkansas in July, okay? It doesn't make any sense. And obviously, if it happens, it's a very, very unusual event. There's something else important about the fact that a storm would come at the wheat harvest. Does anybody know what it is? A storm, especially a violent storm, when all of the wheat is ready to be harvested, would be an absolute disaster for the people. It would destroy the crop. Everything that they've worked for, and so they would have to wait for the next crop and live off of anything else that they had. They would survive, but it would be very, very difficult because the crop would be destroyed. So these two things are in play here that we have to be aware of to really appreciate what's happening in this text. But God does send the storm. Samuel prays, and the storm goes away later on. Now the question comes up, is God in the storm? I shared with you this morning a story of just one person in Houston, and there's story after story after story. I was really tired most of the time last week, but a few times I got a chance to speak with some evacuees, listen to their story, encourage them a little bit, pray with them, and so forth. But we were just so busy, there wasn't a lot of ministry time. There is some. But the question comes up, the God question. It just comes up at times like this. And that fellow that I was telling you about this morning, whose story is on Baptist Press right now, Paul Matlock, the storm raised the God question for him. I didn't tell you this morning, but he and his wife had just finished restoring their house. Houston also had floods in 2016, and they talk about the tax day flood, because on April the 17th, which was tax day in 2016, there was a flood, and their house was destroyed in April of 2016. They just got finished restoring it, and now it's been destroyed again. So you can imagine the kind of despair that Paul was going through and how happy he was when he saw disaster relief come to help him. By the way, in case you don't know it, Southern Baptist Disaster Relief, Arkansas Disaster Relief, is not just going and feeding people, although that's an important component in a disaster. There are also teams that go out with chainsaws and cut up trees and pull trees away from houses that have been destroyed. There are teams that go out, and they're called mud out teams, where you go into an area like Houston or Florida, and the first thing you have to do in these houses, you just have to get the mud out of them and take all the furniture and all the clothes and all the stuff that's destroyed and ruined. You have to carry it all out to the street and line it up and get the mud out. Then there are teams that come in, and they're trained to see how high the water went, decide how much sheetrock has to come off, pull the sheetrock off. They've been trained to use the chemicals to treat the wood and everything that's left over, so that then somebody can come in after that later on and rebuild the floors and the walls and so forth. And there are other things as well. There are chaplains and so forth. So our, Southern Baptist Disaster Relief is a very complicated and broad ministry. The feeding is a big part of it, but there's a lot more to it as well. So the teams that came to Paul's house, the man I was telling you about this morning, they were teams that were coming to do mud out and help him get his house rebuilt and so forth. So he was asking the God question. He was asking, is God mad at me? What is going on here? God has put us together in such a way that things have to make sense. And when something happens and it doesn't make sense to us, it just throws us into a mental state where we have to try to sit down and work through it. You may be going through one of those right now. Sometimes those will last weeks, months, even years, trying to work through something that just didn't make sense. And the question is God in the storm? But let me ask you, what do you think? Is God in the storm? Okay? He's the what, Bob? He's the anchor in the storm? Okay. Okay? When the storm hits, we need to pick up our Bible and start reading, and He'll carry us through it. What would be the implications if we were to say, no, God is not in the storm? That He's not in control. Why? Maybe Satan's in the storm. Maybe the storm came from the devil. Okay, this really, we end up going back to Job, don't we? Because Job had a similar situation, and Satan was involved, but what? God was supervising. He was ultimately in control. We have to answer this question, yes, even though it creates other questions that then must be answered. But this is the foundation. We go back to this. We start here, and we begin to build the house. And this is the foundation. Is God in the storm? We have to say, yes, He is. Now, I know that creates serious problems for people. It doesn't create a problem for you if you're not going through a storm, because it's an intellectual exercise. If you're not going through a storm tonight, this is easy to talk about. But if you're going through a storm, if it's something other than a hurricane, and I'm using storm here metaphorically, if you're going through something and you're wondering why God is allowing this to happen to you, this is far more than an intellectual exercise. This is very personal. And it's something that you just have to work through. And it's hard to start here, but you have to. When you start here, it makes you mad at God. If God is in the storm, why doesn't He turn it off? Because it hurts. And I know that, but that's where we have to start, and we have to work forward from there. So this text seems to indicate that God used the storm to make a point. What is the point that He's trying to make in this particular situation with this particular storm? What's that? Okay. All right, they were kind of trying to take a step back from God. You know, God, you've been our king. We understand all that, but we want a king like all the other people. And God is saying, no, you need to understand that I am involved. I'm close. Somebody else. What is God saying in this particular storm right here to the people of Israel? What's that, Karen? Why not? Because He was the king. They're really trying to replace Him. They're trying to be like the rest of the world. Tammy? Okay. All right. He can provide. He provides and He takes away. Absolutely. We've kind of, modern man has gotten the idea that Darwin provided for us, not God. But did he? You understand what I'm saying when I say Darwin provided for us, right? That everything just came by accident. There's a great article on Baptist Press right now. Kathleen, you read it, didn't you? Where a scientist is pointing out that the weight of the unanswered questions of neo-Darwinian theory is getting heavier and heavier and heavier. Did you notice that I didn't call it Darwinian theory? I called it neo-Darwinian theory. What does that mean, neo-Darwinian? It means new Darwinian theory. Most people don't realize that Darwin's theories have already collapsed once, decades after that he proposed them. And so a neo-Darwinian theory had to come in and take its place. And now we may be coming to the second collapse. It's inevitable. And what this scientist points out is the problem with Darwin is, first of all, there's no foundation. Darwinism has never answered the question of how the first self-replicating biological life form sprang into existence. That's an unanswered question. That's a huge unanswered question. Because that's what everybody expected Darwin's theories to eventually answer. To answer the question of how the first self-replicating biological organism sprang into existence. Here we are more than 100 years later, and scientists have to admit that they're no closer to answering that question than when Darwin published his theories back in the 1800s. Now, it's not generally known because they don't want it to be generally known, but more and more people are becoming aware of it. And also, Darwin's theories really have failed to answer the question of the variety of life. But we didn't come here to talk about Darwin tonight. My point is that God is our provider. We're not here by accident, even though that seems to be the popular prevailing theory, that people want to push God out of their life and say, it's just an accident, it's a happenstance. And so I am the captain of my ship, and I can do what I want to with it. And God says, no, you're not the captain of your ship. And you can't do anything you want to. The only reason you can do what you're doing is because I'm allowing you to do it. I put the ground underneath your feet. I put the air in your mouth that you breathe, the food that you eat, the water that you drink, the light that enables you to see. There's nothing that any of us are doing that God isn't providing moment by moment by moment. None of it is by accident. That's a fascinating discussion. I love it. I'd like to keep going on, but let's come back to the storm here for a minute. Here's God who obviously used a storm, in this case, to make a point with his people. Can you think of other examples in the Bible, Old Testament or New, where God used a storm to make a point? When Jesus walked on water, I'm not sure if there was a storm there, but you're pretty close. There was a storm on that same body of water, the Sea of Galilee. Noah. Woo, talk about a storm. What was the point of the storm when Noah was alive? There's 2 points to Noah's storm, Noah's flood. What are they? That's exactly right. And with good, solid theological terms, too. I love you, Kathleen. Good job. Judgment and redemption. Noah's flood tells us 2 things about God. Number 1, yes, he will judge. And number 2, yes, he will save. And those are 2 very important things about God. Modern man, thinking about God, loves the second thing. Oh, God's our Savior. He loves us. He's kind. But he would never judge us. That's why sermons are largely absent discussion of hell. And that's why we have books published now by people like Rob Bell trying to convince us that the Bible doesn't teach hell. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what Bible he's reading. But my Bible very plainly speaks of the judgment of God and the redemption of God. Is the redemption of God of any value if there's no judgment? None whatsoever. And so if you throw out God's judgment, you throw out his redemption, you basically throw out the whole system that is represented in the Bible. What are some other storms that God used in the Bible? Candy? One of my favorites, Jonah. Here's the thing about Jonah is that, you know, he was told to go to Nineveh, and he went the opposite direction, which meant that he had to catch a boat. And when the storm caught up with him, it not only caught up with him, it caught up with whom? Everybody else on the boat. You know, and sometimes the storm might just be for the guy on the other side of the boat. And we might think, well, hey, that's not fair. Well, I guess not, but tell God. Charles, I'm not sure I want to be on a boat with you. Charles said, I guess he had to have somebody on the boat to throw him to the fish. So, yeah. Charles is our pragmatist. Jonah 1 chapter 4 says, Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. Okay, that's a good one. What was the message of the storm in Jonah? Now, I would put it this way: it's awful hard to run from God. And I know that from experience. Some of you do probably too. Because there ain't no place to run that he can't find you. Karen, you have one? Okay. Paul, at the end of Acts, a huge section of the book of Acts, Luke devotes to describing a storm that just drove them for weeks, and they despaired of life. But Paul, in the midst of that storm, demonstrated some strength spiritually when everyone else had given up, because he trusted the Lord. He believed that God was taking him to Rome, and that nothing would stop that, not even a storm. So in the midst of the storm, Paul believed in the sovereignty of God, and he didn't despair over the storm. That's a good one. Can you think of another one? The plagues of Egypt is a really, really good one. God shows up in the storms and the other plagues. And when he finally gets the people of Israel out into the desert at Sinai, and he appears to give the Ten Commandments, he appears in what? In a storm. Thunder and lightning and loud trumpet blasts and billows of smoke. It was more than a storm, but there was a storm in there as well. Why? Why would God show up like that? Get their attention. Kathleen? To demonstrate his power. He's about to enter into a covenant with them. He's going to give them the Ten Commandments. He wants them to understand that these commandments, as we say with legislation, have teeth, so to speak, okay? That there's some bite to them. Can you think of another storm? Jesus asleep in the boat. And I love that one because here's typically how that's been taught that I've heard. And unfortunately, I've even taught it this way years ago, and I bet you've heard this too. So you go through the story, you know it. They're out on the Sea of Galilee. A bad storm comes up. Most of these guys were fishermen, and so they had been in storms on this lake before, but they despaired of their life, and so this must have been quite the storm. Jesus is asleep. They wake him up. Don't you care? We're going to die. And he speaks to the storm, and there's a great calm, and he calls them what? Little faiths. The King James Version says, "O ye of little faith." It's literally in the Greek, it's little faiths. You little faith guys. And they were scared. Here's the amazing thing about this, and this is why a lot of times we miss the point of it. Usually the way this is taught is, you tell me if I'm right. Usually the way this is taught is, just trust the Lord and he'll come and take all the storms out of your life. Boy, that'll preach. I mean, you can preach that, and people feel good about that, and walk right out the door and hit a storm. And then they're asking the God question. Is God in the storm? What is the point, really, of that episode in Jesus' life? That's pretty much what it boils down to, because at the end, Paul said Jesus is Lord, because at the end of this episode, the way it ends is that they're scared. And they ask a question. And what is the question? Who is this guy who talks to storms and they obey? The gospel writers are telling us what we're supposed to be focusing on there. We're so self-centered and focused on our own lives that we miss what the Bible's telling us, and we change it into something that's related to God protecting us and keeping us safe. But God is in the storm. He's trying to do something. And in that storm, he was making them realize who Jesus really is. Because only God has control of the storm, and Jesus has control of the storm. So he must be God. And that's beginning to dawn on them now, and it scares them. Who are we following here? Who are we following here? Can you think of any other storms in the Bible? It's related. It's not a storm, but it's God using nature. It really is, yeah. Joseph ended up in Egypt as a result of a famine, and because of that, saved the people of Israel. But let's back up a little bit. I'm glad you brought that up. We haven't gone deep enough there. So there's a famine. God's people are in danger, in this wonderful story of how God works in the life of Joseph that most of us probably as children grew up hearing. Joseph in the coat of many colors and all of that. And through all of those circumstances, he ends up in Egypt, and the people of God end up in Egypt where there's plenty of food, and they're saved. Some of you may remember this from when we went through the book of Genesis recently. We spent 3 or 5 years, whatever it was, before we started with Matthew. And as I studied that, I said, we really haven't gone deep enough in this story. We need to ask this question. Who's in charge of the famine? And the answer is God. And so then the next question is what? Why did he send the famine in the first place? This isn't just about God saving the people from the famine. It's about God using the famine to do something with the people. There's a bigger story that was going on in their lives. They ended up in Egypt. They ended up as slaves, and then God displayed his power, bringing them out of slavery. There's no way they could see all of that. Not in that generation. They were part of such a big story that it was impossible for them to see that they were just one scene in this cosmic drama of God's redemption, and their part in that scene was to struggle with a famine. And so our entire life might be just one little scene in the drama of this cosmic drama of redemption, and we may happen to have been placed at a point where he says, you're going to struggle with a famine. That's your part. And you're going to be part of the big story. And when we all get to heaven, when the roll is called up yonder, as we sang this morning, and we see the big story, we're going to say, oh, there I am. That was my part right there. That's me. But while we live in here, our view is so limited, and we don't like our part, and so we get mad at God. Why do I have to live where there's a storm? Why can't I live where he is or where she is? Well, you know what they say, the grass is always greener on the other side. You don't know what's really going on over there. But it's an honor to be any part of the drama of God's cosmic redemption. Can you think of any other storms? That's an interesting one. It was a fire. It was a great wind. It was an earthquake. And it kind of seems to contradict what we're talking about here, because it says in all of those cases what? God was not in the earthquake. He was not in the fire. He was not in the great wind. And then he heard a what? That's a hard Hebrew phrase to render in English. When you start reading it in English Bibles, there's a lot of different ways that put it. One of them says a gentle whisper. And he did what? You remember what he did next? He covered his face and went out. Because he knew God was in the gentle whisper. But he knew God was holy, and you approach God in a certain way. You just don't come busting into the room, swinging your hands, telling God what he needs to do. That's not the way you... Okay? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, the prophets of Baal. That's a good one. Well, there are other storms in the Old and the New Testament, and metaphorically speaking, we have difficulties. There could be a literal storm like Harvey or Irma, but there's a lot of other difficulties in our lives as well. And these difficulties sometimes make us angry at God. Atheists claim that these difficulties are the first step through the doorway into atheism many, many times. So here's what happens. They see something like a Hurricane Harvey or Irma, and it seems like it is it's just random. One person dies, another person doesn't. And they ask themselves, why did this person die and this person not die? They don't know. And so they despair that there's any reason. And they give up. And they walk through the door of atheism and they say, there must not be a God. There must not be anything making sense of all that's happening. It's just random. I can't live that way. There's something in my heart, and I believe it's in the atheist's heart too, and I base that on long conversations with atheists. because they'll turn right around a moment or two later and talk as if things should make sense. Since we're made in the image of God, He has stamped on us this idea that even horrible, terrible things must have some kind of meaning to them. Something good must come out of it. How many times has a family lost a child and then become crusaders for a particular disease? Why? Because something inside of them rises up and says, this can't be for nothing. We can't live that way. We just can't think that way. We're not made that way because we're made in the image of God. We're made in the image of a God who brings order to things. So what is God doing in the storm? Well, probably different things. But I am convinced that there are people that without a storm would ignore God. And you say, well, Richard, that's pretty extreme. For God to use a storm just to get them to notice Him. But let's stop and remind ourselves what hangs in the balance. Because we're talking about eternity. If we turn our back and walk away from God, then we may end up in hell if we never put our faith in Jesus Christ. And it's worth a storm to stop us in our tracks and make sure that we experience that cosmic redemption that God is doing. Did I see a hand over here somewhere? Yes, ma'am. That's right. Yep. Never seen a cow fast before, but it happens. Let me add one caveat to this discussion. Job's friends. I've learned a lot from them, good and bad. Remember when Job was going through his difficulty in life, and he was asking all these hard questions that people ask when a disaster strikes. And his friends showed up, and the first thing they did was what? Nope. Thank you, Gene. They looked at him and they were stunned. Their breath was taken away by what had happened to their friend. And they sat down, and for how long? For 7 days, they did what? Didn't say a word. Best pastoral counseling you could ever get. Because on the 8th day, they opened their mouth and did what? Put their foot in it. Thank you, Jamie. Made fools out of themselves. And they made Job's life harder, and they got a little rebuke from the Lord at the end. By the way, when the Lord shows up at the end of Job, He shows up in the storm. Look at it again. And He spoke to Job from the storm. But anyway, let's go back to his friends. When somebody is going through a storm, don't try to explain to them why. Just don't do it. That's not the time. This is the time to do that. But when somebody's in a storm, what they just need you to show up. You may not, people say, I can't go over there, I don't know what to say. That young man was killed this morning in that automobile accident. People are thinking, I don't know what to say. A 16-year-old dies on a Sunday morning in a car accident. What do you say? Well, first of all, you don't have to say anything. You just go and you weep and you hug and you pat them on the back and you leave. It's not time for words. It's too intense. They don't need platitudes, what will sound like platitudes, even if they're right. It's just not the right time. They'll work through it. There will come a time. We can pray for one another when we're in a place like that. And then maybe a time will come when we can listen as they talk and try to start working through it. Because you don't work through one of these things easily. We may have made it sound kind of simple tonight. That was not the idea. Because there ain't nothing simple about this. Because it may look simple on paper, but in the heart, it's tough. It's tough. So you know somebody that's going through something like this, a disaster, pray for them, encourage them. We need to pray for that family over there at Emmanuel if that's where they go. And the next time something like this happens to you, hang on, because God's doing something. He hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't forgotten you. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you tonight that you are the God of the storm, but you're also the God of the calm and the God of abundance, the God of joy and laughter. Our lives really are rich and full of different experiences, and each of them, the good and the bad, is meant to point us to you somehow. Give us the wisdom, Lord, to see it. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand and sing. God bless.